eat a biscuit and find my unmute button was too much of a challenge for me there. So I'm just trying to have a look to see how many people have signed up so far. Looks like it's ramping up to, I think you said we had heading towards 30 people, Jill, is that right?
Yeah, there should be, there was 31 signed up, plus all the speakers. So good turnout today.
So we haven't got together in this group for quite a while, so it's good to get something in the diary. My thinking for this session was that it wasn't going to be too formal. I don't know how everyone else is feeling, but I'm missing turning up to some sector events like this and being able to sit in a room and have a coffee over the sort of cake and biscuits table and just get to understand what's happening at other institutions. And I find that part of what we do has really been missing over the past year. And I'm usually quite content to sit out here in the middle of nowhere and not interact all that much. So if I'm starting to feel that kind of social interaction gap, then I think we must all be feeling that. I think particularly around this topic, energy master planning, there's a lot changing in this area, and there's a lot happening in this area, and all of the institutions are going down a similar track, but with lots of different constraints and barriers and opportunities. And I think this would be a really good session for us all just to try to informally go around the houses and understand what's happening at each of the institutions in Scotland. We've got a few presenters today. The idea for today wasn't that we were going to have 2 hours of PowerPoint. It was there was going to be a handful of presenters just pitching what's happening at a few institutions, where there's maybe highlighting some of the issues that we're all facing, representative across the sector. Joanna from the University of Cambridge is going to speak for about 5 minutes. Keith from the University of St. Andrews is going to speak, or was going to speak for a few minutes about what's happening at St. Andrews, but he's on annual leave this week, so he's fired through a presentation, which I'll put up on the screen and we can look through together. I'm going to speak a little bit about what's happening at the University of Edinburgh, particularly around the heat networks side of things. And Dave Gorman's going to speak a little bit about offsetting. And after that, the idea is that we kind of open up the floor to have a discussion around what's happening in each of your institutions, and we try to find some common ground on where, maybe not as a whole, but in groups, we can start to find some common issues where we can get together and work with each other to learn from each other. We've got a survey which Jill had emailed around to everybody. I'm not sure if everyone's had a chance to fill that survey in. What were you thinking, Jill? Did we want to give everyone a few minutes just now? I don't have 10 minutes of introduction. Like what you've had is about as good as it's going to get. So now might be a good time to take 5 minutes to let everybody complete the survey. And then that gives Jill a chance to pull it all together and get the results back for us later on in the program today. Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah, that sounds good. So it was in the email I sent to everyone yesterday. I'll go find that link and I'll stick it in the chat as well.
I think this is where we need the 3 minutes of elevator music, just to give everybody a theme tune to do the survey by.
There, that's it in the chat if I didn't have the link handy.
Yeah, so if everyone can just take, it should only take 3 or 4 minutes. And they're fairly simple questions. If everyone can open that up, complete the survey. And by about 10 past, we'll kick off with the presentations. So lots of blank screens there. So we'll give everyone a couple more minutes to put their cameras back on and to join us. Okay, hopefully everyone's had a chance to open up the survey. I appreciate that. I think, Jill, maybe after we do the quick round of presentations before we move into the discussion, we can pull up the results. Does that seem like sensible timing? Then that can maybe help inform some of the questions that come up.
Yes, sure, will do.
Session. So for about half an hour, we've got a round of presentations. As I said, I apologize in advance. It's going to be a bit Dean Robot heavy because Keith's not here, so I'm going to run through his slides for him. I'm just checking to make sure Dave Corman can still join us at the end, and if for whatever reason he's unable to make it this morning, you're going to be stuck with me for that piece as well. So first up, we had Joanna. So welcome, Joanna. I know this is the EOC Scotland representative bunch here, but it's really good to have you join us today. I don't know if anybody's had the opportunity to visit Cambridge, either directly with Joanna's team or through some of the leadership labs and see some of the good work that's happening down there. But I've certainly taken away a lot of good examples and a lot of good advice from some of the work that they're doing, particularly in construction. And I know, Joanna, you're quite far ahead in terms of some of the sort of intelligent target setting around emissions reductions. Really good to hear what you have to say. Are you ready to?
Yep, ready to kick off.
Thanks, Joanna.
I will just share my screen. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah, that's great, Joanna.
Yeah,
great. Okay, wonderful. So hello everyone, thank you very much for inviting me, particularly thanks to Dean for asking me to come and talk to you today. I've been asked to give a 5-minute snapshot about our approach at Cambridge. So this will be a whistle-stop tour, but I'd be very happy to take any questions or, you know, for you to contact me afterwards if helpful. So we have developed a science-based target, and we believe we're the first university in the world to have done that. And having spent 2 years saying that, no one has yet told me that that's not the case. So I'm more confident in that statement now than I was when we publicised our target. And I think most people are probably familiar with the concept, but just in case you're not, it's essentially the science-based target is a methodology, you know, an approach that essentially develops your target using models that calculate the level of carbon reduction that an organisation needs to achieve to do its fair share. And they, as the name suggests, they are very much grounded in science. And the starting point for this was, you know, or is the Paris Agreement. So we've chosen to do this for a number of reasons. One is because, you know, like many of you, our academics have been involved in developing the understanding of climate science, and therefore we feel we should listen to that in setting our targets. There's the moral point that it defines our fair share towards achieving the Paris Agreement. And I think the most practically useful part of it is because they're grounded in science, they're not arbitrary. It's helped reduce this, what was almost constant debate, particularly with the students, about whether our targets were ambitious enough, whether they were quick enough, you know, et cetera, because, you know, that our target is no longer arbitrary. So what this means is that we have set a target to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon emissions to absolute zero by 2048. We also have an aspiration to achieve that 10 years early, so by 2038. And because this is an absolute reduction, it won't include any offsetting. What this graph shows is that light green line is what our science-based target looks like between, you know, 2015 and 2048. And we've also committed to staying, you know, ahead of that line. So, you know, we want to be following that line or below it up to up to 2048 or 2038. The dark green line shows our current carbon emissions, and the slightly dotted line, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this bit here is our market-based emissions. So these are some of the key initiatives we're using to get there. We have a power purchase agreement in place for about 20% of our electricity. Well, it was 20% of our electricity. It now accounts for about 17% because our overall consumption has gone up due to growth of the estate. We're also about to look to sign our second PPA later this year, and we actually have a strategy in place to essentially put a PPA in place every 2 years till we get to the total maximum that we would want to supply under a PPA, which will probably be in the region of about 80%. We're looking to develop large on-site renewables and have a project underway at the moment looking to get planning permission for a large-scale solar farm. It turns out that actually the most challenging bit is about how we actually get that electricity into our buildings, and it's raised issues around some of our HV infrastructure on the site that it's due to supply, and actually that's the major challenge, is getting that upgraded so that any electricity generated by this solar farm can actually be used within our buildings, because we are looking to private wire it directly to one of our sites. One, because the financial business case stacks up and it's a much stronger business case, but really because there's no capacity within the local grids to feed it into the grid without paying significant amounts of money for grid upgrades. Because we have an absolute zero carbon target, we need to remove gas from the estate, because whilst the electricity grid can and will decarbonise, the gas grid will never hit zero carbon. So this is particularly challenging. We have a very varied estate, like I'm sure many of you do. You know, we're city centre based, but we also have new sites on the outskirts of Cambridge. We have buildings that are 600 years old, up to, you know, large scale physics laboratories that are just under construction. So we have a policy in place that we will not put gas into any of our new buildings. And the physics laboratory I mentioned is currently being built with no gas. It's using ground source heat pumps for all of its space and water heating. But this also, you know, it itself is a challenge in part in the transition period. So how do we make sure projects that are underway or just kicking off are built without any gas, even though they might have been contracted under other arrangements, but also that we don't end up putting solutions in place that are actually not the best ones for the long term, just due to the need to avoid putting gas in. So there's some very interesting discussions going on, you know, about all of that. We've also completed a high-level feasibility study about how we might remove gas from the estate. And that unsurprisingly says that for the majority of our buildings and our sites, a site-based solution is going to be the way forward. We're probably fed by either ground source or sometimes air source heat pumps. And it put a figure on it. You know, this is a very high level figure, and we have to be careful about how we'll use it, because otherwise we'll get held to it, that it's likely to cost us somewhere in the region of £200 million above business as usual. We're also looking at our capital programme and how do we incorporate carbon into our decision making. You know, so the methodologies for measuring embodied carbon and low carbon building design exist, but actually one of the biggest challenges is how we embed that into our decision making and make sure the appropriate level of capital funding is available to underdo those work. And then we have a number of you know, we have a very large scale energy efficiency retrofit project programme underway, which probably mirrors what many of you are doing. There's very much focus on lighting replacements and building fabric improvements, because obviously that will also support the degasification programme. We're looking at how we can devolve charges for electricity to departments, because at the moment they're all paid centrally. And obviously that doesn't put any incentive upon departments to reduce electricity themselves. So we're developing something called the electricity devolution programme, which was due to be all rolled out by now until COVID hit. We're having to, we've had to delay it, but also B, we're having to relook at how are we going to set our baselines, because the purpose of using using historic baselines is not as simple now. We've had the abnormal, consumption over COVID. We're looking to electrify our fleet. And then finally, the bit I just wanted to flag was for the first year last year, we had independent assurance of our sustainability data undertaken by PwC, predominantly for transparency and credibility, because we feel that when we hopefully get to the stage where we claim we are zero carbon, we feel it's going to be very important to have third party verification of that statement, and we've started it now as part of the the learning process. It's actually proved to be incredibly helpful in terms of improving the reporting of our data. So what we don't have is a really clear roadmap about exactly how we're going to reach our science-based target and how much that is going to cost, which was, of course, one of the things that Council asked us when we asked them to approve the target. What we did there and what they brought into is we said, we can't tell you exactly how we're going to get there because we don't know exactly what the development of the estate's going to look like. Some of the technologies we will use don't yet exist, and a number of other factors. But what we did say to them is, we believe we can get there. We have a number of building blocks, and this graph is just an indicative roadmap of how we might get there. So it's not exact, but it just shows that it is possible, and that actually what we will do is we will bring business cases to the university as and when they are developed. But actually this will end up costing the university money, but it's the right thing to be doing. And I think one of the opportunities that COVID's given us in terms of our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions is around the refocus on our estate and whether we need all of our space. And I'm sure similar conversations are taking place within your own institutions. And we at Cambridge had one of the worst space efficiency metrics prior to COVID, let alone, now that we expect there to be hybrid working and online teaching, way into the future. So one of our recovery programs is looking at reshaping our estate and asking those difficult questions around, do we need all of our estate? Well, the answer is no, but actually, are we willing to dispose of some of this? So what my carbon manager did to support that was this very high level analysis, which essentially shows over a 30-year period, if we implemented a really ambitious carbon reduction program to hit our target that includes everything like, building our own renewables, power purchase agreements, shifting our heat demand from gas to electricity or zero carbon sources, improving the thermal performance of our buildings, doing our energy retrofit projects, with a really significant price tag attached, that would actually save about the same carbon as we would save if we reduced our estate by 1% a year over the next 30 years, so by 30%, which is absolutely achievable for Cambridge. And of course, reducing the size of our estate would have financial savings. What we'll end up doing in practice is a bit of both, to hit our target. But actually the carbon message is a really strong driver to support the Reshaping the Estate programme. So I'm just going to finish by giving a snapshot of what we've got on the cards next, continuing all of that work I've already talked about. But we know that our science-based target currently doesn't include our fugitive emissions. So we're about to kick off work to include those within our science-based target. We're looking to improve our baseline for Scope 3 emissions. So that is around improving the data capture that we already have. And fortunately, the university has a number of programs underway looking at implementing an online expenses system and improving our financial data that will support the measurement of our Scope 3 emissions. But we're also undertaking a materiality assessment across all 15 categories of Scope 3, so we can assure that we're reporting against all of those categories that are deemed material. We will then look to set a science-based target for our Scope 3 emissions, which will include, offsetting. So we're in the process of developing an internal offsetting scheme that meets the rigorous requirements for offsetting that our academics require. And then finally, the Collegiate University of Cambridge is complex and has many constituent parts. And at the moment, our science-based target covers what we call the academic portion, the operational portion of the University of Cambridge. But we're also working with our associated businesses, being Cambridge University Press and Cambridge Assessment, to set their science-based targets, and that they're fairly far down the line. And we've also developed a framework for our colleges. And at the moment, all 31 of our colleges are working on setting their own science-based target. So the objective is that one day soon, we will have science-based targets for all constituent parts of the collegiate university, although they won't necessarily be the same targets. Well, in fact, they won't be the same target. They will all be set individually, but we will be able to say what the science-based target is for each part of the Collegiate University of Cambridge. So thank you very much, everyone. I mean, I'm going to be able to stay around for part of today, but obviously if you want to contact me after today, here are my contact details. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. That was excellent. I mean, the original plan was that we would do some Q&A after the speakers, but I'm conscious you're on a tight schedule today, so maybe it would be better just to pause now.
I'm happy. I can stay for the Q&A after the speakers. That's
okay.
Not a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that. So what I suggest is we go through the rest of the presentations, and then just before we break, we maybe just some questions back to the speakers, if that's okay. What I'll do is, Keith Thomason at St. Andrews University was going to speak to us today, but he's on annual leave, but he sent across some slides. I don't know if anyone else was aware of this until recently. David Stutchfield has recently retired. Wasn't aware of that until a couple of weeks ago. So he was originally lined up to speak for us, but a lot is changing up at St. Andrews. Just bear with me. I'll bring up Keith's presentation.
That's good, Dean. We can see that.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Just having some Zoom issues. I've lost Zoom, so I can't see any of you, but I can see Keith's presentation. There we go. So, obviously this isn't my presentation, so if it sounds like I'm stumbling through it, I am stumbling through it.
Actually, sorry to interrupt, Dean. It's quite blurry on my screen. Can other people read it? Or is that just me?
It's blurry on mine as well.
It's a little blurry.
Yeah, it's all blurry.
Do you know what, Dean? Why don't I share it and you can talk through it? Should we do that?
Sounds good, yeah.
Yeah, super, okay. Can everyone see that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Super, thanks.
So St. Andrews also set themselves a net zero target, quite an ambitious one, to 2035, which includes all of their direct and indirect emissions. Which looks like it includes offsetting from about 2025 up to 2035, which is quite interesting. They formed an environmental sustainability board to steer. There is stage-driven master plan. And I think he gets into a bit more detail in the later slides. So maybe move on to the next one. I think everyone's reasonably familiar with some of the large projects at St. Andrews. So what Keith is pointing out here is they've got their large biomass heat facility up at Guard Bridge, which I understand is also expanding with a lot of regional community development, which is a really outstanding project for the university and the community. It looks like they're putting in planning permission for their wind farm. Item number 2, their clean energy generation. And I think Keith has some slides later on, which explains the capacity of that wind farm. But presumably that's quite a significant. We just go back one, Joe. Is that okay? Can we go back a couple of slides? Just, yeah. So I think I don't know if, obviously I'm not of St. Andrews, so I could be not quite getting this right, but I believe the wind farm application at St. Andrews was knocked back at one stage due to its proximity to the Air Force Base nearby. So presumably there's quite a big planning risk for them in terms of that wind farm, but if they can site that wind farm reasonably adjacent to their own campus, that's a solution, I guess, which many of us maybe not, we won't have that kind of land on our doorstep that would allow us to connect that local generation directly to our sites. But obviously a big risk for them if the planning for that falls through. And
Dean,
project was
just to say that planning did go through before, but I think what delayed the project was the cost of upgrading the infrastructure to put that back and looking at trying to get that energy back into the campus rather than just back into the grid. Right, so okay. Within that, the planning application lapsed, so they'll have to go back through it. They did have an arduous process, strong engagement with the local community, and unfortunately the local community council decided not to support it, but they did overcome that hurdle before, so hopefully they'll have success again.
And I imagine there's quite a body of expertise being built up at St. Andrews just around that community planning issues, both with their heat networks and the development of their wind farm. So, you know, for all of us, an outstanding resource to learn from as we start to maybe look at some of these opportunities for our own campuses. The third project I'm less familiar with, I think that's a newer one for St. Andrews. Certainly, I've only learned of it recently, is looking at how they can put a bit more renewable energy generation rate in the town center, heat pumps and solar installations. So it'd be really good to learn a little bit more about what St. Andrews are doing in that space. So if we move on to the next one, Jill. So I think everyone's reasonably familiar with the Guard Bridge project, or the Eden campus project. It's been operating since, from what Keith is saying, there, 2017. 23 kilometers of pipework connecting the heat generation at that facility to their main campus in St. Andrews. And I believe they're doing quite a lot of work to use that space as an innovation center. Dave Beards from the funding council is here. Dave, have you been involved in that project? Are you familiar with any of the kind of detail of what's happening?
Yeah, we supported the initial CHP with a capital grant in 2013 I think we put in 10 million and there was another 10 million from the university. And subsequently, I'll come onto it in my slides, we gave them a loan for the solar portion of the site, which I think is mentioned on the next slide. So yeah, we chucked in some money every 10 years or so, it seems.
So if we look at the next slide, Jill. So 1.2 megawatts solar farm, as Dave just mentioned there. Obviously, they've got an outstanding site at the Eden campus, lots of large warehouses, good roof space, lots of areas to sort of maximize the solar contribution there, and presumably integrated with the local community as well. And then, yeah, as Andy had mentioned there, the planning permission of their Kenley wind farm, 6 2-megawatt turbines, and combined with the solar project, would meet the university's electricity demand. So I think it's probably an issue that we all are faced with, each of our campuses, whatever their regional location is. There's lots of different risks and opportunities for all of us. So I think this is becoming clear as we all look at our own campuses and our own sites, is there's not one clear strategy that we can all mimic. I think what looks good for each of us is very, very different. And some of the challenges and issues that we have to face are different, but I think important that we all get together and learn, and St. Andrews are, I would suggest, about a decade ahead of many in terms of some of their projects with the large-scale renewable energy projects integrated to the local community. So much to learn from St. Andrews. Next slide. And this is a project that I'd like to learn a little bit more from Keith when he's off annual leave and able to join us. Looking at what St. Andrews are doing in the city centre, because this probably a lot of parallels to what Joanna's looking at Cambridge, certainly what we're looking at Edinburgh as well, is what do we do with our historic buildings in terms of building retrofits and integrating technologies, what's possible in the congested city centre in terms of heat pump, sourcing heat for our heat pumps. And it looks like St. Andrews are tackling a lot of the same issues that Joanna has referenced, and I'm going to reference shortly as well, as what does a credible building retrofit strategy look like? How does that fit into our renewable energy generation? I know St. Andrews have a really good history of trialing lots of energy efficiency investments and just seeing how that works on their site. So plenty to learn from Keith as they roll that out across their campuses. Interested, is aim to achieve low embodied and life cycle carbon building upgrade standard as part of their master planning exercise. So I'm very curious to see, much like Joanna, how that sort of wider scope of carbon emissions beyond scope 1 and 2 is being incorporated into the baseline and strategies going forward. I'm afraid without Keith here, that's as much as I can read off the slide and tell you there. So it looks like from the analysis they've done on their future strategy, about 60-40, 60%. And I'm not sure if the emissions reduction or if this is cost. Strategy is focused on energy efficiency. Sure. Resonates so much with the universe. I think the importance of those build strategies and those energy efficiency strategies in terms of that 20-year vision, 10-20-year vision on getting down to net zero. Next slide. So much like Joanna has referenced for Cambridge, a big part of the University of St. Andrews strategy is to get gas off of their site. I think they've made pretty strong strides forward and getting low carbon fuels. Although there's maybe discussion around what biomass looks like in terms of the Scotland strategy going forward. It'd be interesting to speak to Keith about that. But they've made great strides at St. Andrews to get gas off of their site through the Eden Campus project. And it'll be interesting just to see how much of their gas network is yet to be removed from the city centre. And how thermal storage starts to fit into that as well. Be curious to pick up with Keith as well on what their offsetting strategy looks like going forward. I know that's a key challenge for many of us about what an offsetting strategy looks like. And it looks like for St. Andrews from about 2025, they are forecasting that they will need to have some sort of offsetting strategy in place. So maybe move on to the next slide, Jill. That's us. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for bearing with me. I know that's me trying to interpret somebody else's slides, which isn't all that elegant, but it's good to get a snapshot of what's happening out at St. Andrews. And similar to Joanna, even though if we don't get all of our questions up today, at least we get a good, Keith's a good guy to speak to about some of the projects at St. Andrews. And as we all know, St. Andrews has got a history of some outstanding work, so they tend to be a little bit further ahead than some of us in tackling some of these barriers, and obviously very friendly, always eager to share information, which is helpful. So next up on the agendas, myself, I'll speak a little bit about what's happening at the University of Edinburgh, particularly in the heat networks realm. I'm curious to see if we have the same issue, Jill, where the PowerPoint is fuzzy, but you may have to bear me. I'll fire it over to you.
Yeah, super. Do you want to just send it to me and I'll share it? It's maybe easier because your sound actually broke up just for a moment as well.
Did, right.
So if you're not sharing, it might be better quality for your sound.
Okay, bear with me. And my internet connection where I live is terrible. I've been trialing out using my work mobile phone as a tethering point, but I use up my monthly data allowance in 2 days. So I have to choose my moments wisely when I want to have good upload speeds. So that's the presentation across to yourself, Jill. Just let me know when it arrives.
Okay, sure. It's not arrived yet. It's still not here. Do you want to just see if your share is better this time? No, it's the same. It's quite fuzzy.
That's still quite blurry.
Yeah, really blurry. Sorry, I don't know why it's not come through on my emails yet. It's typical. I usually always have everyone's slides as like a backup.
I take full blame. I take full blame for this. I should have sent them before we started. I'll just double check.
Oh, here we go. It's through.
Okay. This is what we meant by an informal session today, by the way. So.
Okay. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so there's going to be a lot of similar themes from Joanna's presentation with our own in terms of some of the challenges going forward. It's quite heartened to hear Joanna say they don't have a clear pathway yet of how they're getting to their net zero ambitions, which we found as well. We're starting to narrow down what the pathway looks like and what it's likely to cost. But and I think that's one of the key learnings so far, is that this has to be very much a slow, incremental approach. Every year, looking about, see what we're learning, what's happening regionally around us, and taking slow, cautious steps so we maintain on the right pathway. Next slide. So just a bit of context. So at the University of Edinburgh, we're approaching a million square meters of floor area, about 550 properties, 40,000 students, 15,000 staff. Sort of important context for our energy master planning and our net zero strategy is that we have 5 existing heat networks. One new heat network, which is being developed with NHS and Scottish Enterprise Partners. We have one set of properties which is embedded on an NHS site with an existing sort of older heat network, energy network. We've got one very large data center, which we've just put a 24 megawatt supply into. So this is a piece of Scottish national infrastructure in terms of its scale. UK national infrastructure, really. And in terms of utility spend, we're at the moment sitting about £20 million a year. Next slide. So in terms of our net zero ambitions, our goal is to be net zero by 2040. I think the 2 important things for us is that at the moment, there's an ambition to have zero emissions associated, zero scope 1 and 2 emissions. And within our baseline, we're including scope 1 and 2, and not our full suite of scope 3 emissions, but certainly student travel and staff travel, which has been a really strong steer from our principal and executive team to try to broaden that baseline out as far as we credibly can. Next slide, please. In broad brush terms, our energy master plan to date really has these 5 themes. So similar to what Joanna had mentioned, it's about right sizing. So a lot of efficiency savings can be made by improving space utilization, and particularly after the experience of the past year, just looking at how we can make our estate more efficient before we start investing money in improving its performance. The second strand is really around trying to achieve that level of deep energy efficiency, minimizing waste, really accelerating our energy efficiency program, really having to plan carefully what building fabric upgrades look like. For us, we have a really clear strategy on what I would say non-fabric energy efficiency interventions look like, but as soon as we start layering in fabric improvements, the net present value of our various zero carbon pathways starts to go in the wrong direction. So taking a really smart look at how we integrate fabric improvements into our capital plan is an important strategy for us. And we're looking very closely at improving our continuous commissioning capability. So working with our BMS providers to look at how we can be managing the performance of both our energy networks and our buildings to make them. So we have an almost daily understanding of what our energy flows are across the site, and not just those monthly and annual snapshots. Exemplary construction standards. I don't think construction is going to play a big part in where our problems are going forward, but where we are constructing new buildings, they need to be at take a step change up in terms of their build quality. So we're looking very closely at passive certification and how that applies to the sorts of buildings that we need to invest money in. For some of our new buildings, which are still on our capital plan, we're taking this pause in our capital build program to look at some of our more advanced designs and work with our contractors to look at what passive construction might look like. Low carbon heat networks, again, specific University of Edinburgh context, because we have a lot of heat networks, those buried heat networks are a real great asset for us in terms of our net zero strategy and connecting low carbon heat supplies to our demands. So a key part of our strategy is to optimize our existing heat networks, start to incrementally reduce our operating temperatures, start to future-proof our buildings to be able to accept lower temperature heat off those networks. And from our strategic outline cases across each of our campuses, we're really heading towards integrating heat pumps in some configuration, or and possibly in parallel to connecting to regional heat networks in some way, certainly to purchase heat, but also looking at energy storage opportunities as well. Again, lots of uncertainty in that space, and we're just between now and September taking a couple of our sites and moving to the next level of detail. And of course, utilizing both our estate and our sort of research power to get as much added value from our investments as we can in terms of research hubs. So next slide, please. In broad brush terms, the stages that we've been through, we've done a whole host of different pilot projects and studies. So because energy efficiency is such a strong theme in our energy master plan, we've looked across about 350 properties and built up an energy retrofit model. So we know roughly where we get, which projects we have to undertake in which properties and what order, what it's going to cost and what value that's bringing in terms of demand reduction. We've done a long list of low carbon heat supply options. Dave Gorman, who I can see has joined us here, is looked at quite a lot of renewable energy investment options as well prior to our current energy master planning exercise. And more recently, we've done some techno-economic modeling just to look at how those two things come together. So where do we get best value pathways in terms of that combination of energy efficiency investment and investment in particularly heat supply technologies. Because heat networks are so important to our strategy, we've been doing a lot of hydraulic modeling of our networks to look at, can we credibly use our existing heat networks and connected buildings? Can they function at lower operating temperatures? And what's been heartening there is where we have done that hydraulic modeling, we do have a credible pathway towards lower operating temperatures with a lot of our existing investments and assets, which starts to move us in a positive direction. To support our planning, we've been building up lots of digital models, so Energy Pro modeling of our campuses to help us monitor the performance of our energy centers and our heat networks, but also plan and compare the financial forward pathways of some investments on those networks. And as I said, working with our controls providers to test out lots of continuous commissioning and analytics processes. We've completed strategic cases for investments. We've received some funding support from the Resource Efficient Scotland, Zero Waste Scotland team to get some support on board to help us do that first strategic business case across all of our sites. And what that has helped us do is produce that techno-economic model, which helps us understand what the cost and benefits of different investment pathways looks like. And as I say, with that sort of boiled down to at the very end is for us, what looks most credible, both economically and in terms of sort of regional context and risks, is some kind of heat pump strategy, probably some sort of integration with regional heat networks as they develop around Edinburgh, which is highly likely. And we're now moving to the next level of detail. So We've received some significant LCITP support to take 2 of our campuses and take our strategic outline cases for investment through to that detailed business case stage. So now doing a bit more of a REBA stage 3 technical design and more robust financial modeling to help the university understand better what that development pathway looks like on those 2 campuses, and really looking at the financial and commercial modeling in a bit more depth. So next slide, please. So quickly, I think in really short summary, what we've learned, there's no silver bullet. Each of our campuses is a unique little snowflake with different risks and opportunities, right? So we've got the city center buried sites where introducing heat pumps is going to be quite challenging. We've got rural sites where we can look at things like biomethane production, what would be the advantages of that. We've got sites with a combination of sort of large scale solar, which was supported by the SFC, with existing gas-fired CHP electricity production working in tandem, opportunities to work with our DNO to look at how we look at exporting some of that electricity onto the local network. Lots of different opportunities at each campus, and every one of them is very different with its own opportunities and challenges. I'd say the key learning here is that low carbon heat is very expensive. I think we all knew that, but just the scale of the capital cost, which is going to be required, is eye-watering. But it's good to start to pin that down and look at what implications are for different options and how that needs to be sculpted into our capital plan. But what's become very clear as well is that our operating expenses are a big risk going forward, particularly as we electrify our heat and we try to put things like heat pumps into buildings where we won't get operating efficiencies out of heat pumps that you might expect. So our energy efficiency program is absolutely critical to our energy master plan. And a bit like both Keith and Joanna have referenced, we're again in ballpark terms and have to be very careful. What we've costed so far is sort of heading towards the £200 million mark, and about half of that is sitting within an energy efficiency strategy as opposed to a heat supply technology strategy. What that means in real terms for us is increasing annual spend on energy efficiency strategies from something on the scale of 5% of our utility budget to something on the scale of about 15% of our utility budget every year for the next 20 years in a way that's integrated with our capital planning. I think it would be fair to say our current pathways still kind of land at having about 30% residual emissions. And again, just repeating what Joanne has already indicated, what the future looks like 20 years from now is uncertain. And we just need to monitor that space every year as we move forward and capitalize on the opportunities as they arise. And I think for the University of Edinburgh in particular, which is not the context for everyone, is that our buried heat networks are an asset to us, and we really need to look closely at how we get best value out of those. So next slide, please. Yeah, so I mean, our strategy in short is accelerate energy efficiency investments with a heat focus. We need to maximize the lifespan and the value that we can get out of our existing combined heat and power assets. And again, I think those are a strong asset for our DNOs to support some of their regional strategies to support the local electricity network. We need to optimize the performance of our heat networks in the short term and start preparing them to be able to bring on low carbon heat. We are really looking at a heat pump-led, our regional heat network integration strategy, which is we're now moving to sort of a stage 3 technical design on 2 of our campuses to understand in a bit more depth, and still determining what that pathway looks like to absolutely minimize the amount of offsetting which is going to be required. Which is probably a good time to stop because I think Dave Gorman has joined us and he needs to be somewhere in about 6 minutes. So he can probably dive in for 3 or 4 minutes and just talk briefly about the University of Edinburgh's thoughts around offsetting and sequestration. That's really a key theme that Dave has been driving at the University of Edinburgh as our expert at engaging our principal and executive team on why that's critical to our institutional strategy.
Thanks, Dean. Good morning, everybody. I can stay a bit longer. My sincere apologies, folks, that I don't know how to fix this. I have some combination of an overactive spam filter and an overactive clutter filter. And I keep finding very large and important messages go into that unless I remember to check almost daily. And my IS colleague can't seem to fix it. I don't know why. So my apologies. So I won't dash off in 6 or 7 minutes, but I will maybe hang around if needed till about 10 past 11. And very glad to have the chance to say what we're thinking. Doesn't mean it's right. It's just what we're thinking. And sorry I can't join you for a longer period. So it sounds like some interesting conversations. So I guess I would start by saying offsetting has a bad reputation among some. I've heard some academic colleagues, stand up and just basically eviscerate it. And I can understand why. I think because if we're not careful, it's a double-edged sword. It's something that people will use to cheat and to avoid their responsibilities and to do the cheapest possible bare minimum thing. And so I think that people are right to be skeptical, but I still think it has a part to play. So over the next kind of 5 or 10 minutes, I'll maybe just explain where we're coming from. The first thing, and you probably talked about it already, is that for me, you've got to do everything else first, right? So you've got to minimize the emissions from your buildings, and you've got to think about embodied carbon, and you've got to think about travel minimization and energy and decarbon. You've got to do all these things first. And then you've got to use offsets, in my mind, for the residual you can't avoid. And I think that's really, really important. Second thing is it seems to be complicated, so it's one of these areas. I do social investments, and we've done quite a lot now. I've done about 6 million of them, but I still get being told by people who are experts in the area that I'm doing it wrong. I'm like, right, well, okay, whatever. And so there tends to be the same in this space. There are people who have very firm views about how to define what offsets is versus something else. And I would say to anybody who, if you're in a small team and you're on your own, just develop your own understanding for your university based upon what you think is right. Do by all means look at what the experts are telling you, but at the same time, work with what you think is right for your university. So develop some principles for yourself that you think are what is environmentally right. And there is a useful guide that is popping in the chat that I thought was really good, came from the COP network of universities that talks about some of this stuff. Third thing is, I'm old enough now to remember when we talked about sustainability, there wasn't just carbon. And so I think we do need to think about offsets in a bigger picture and make sure it has environmental integrity, and that you're thinking about nature and the natural crisis, and you're thinking about social issues as well. So make sure that you're thinking about it in a bigger picture, and make sure what you're doing has environmental and transparency and some integrity. If you're not careful, you invest somewhere only to find that what people have done is cut down a bit of Brazilian rainforest, ejected the indigenous people, and planted some fast-growing trees to get the maximum carbon offset. So just as I was saying, you have to think about making sure that the broader social issues are not ignored if you're going to be using the market. You also have to think about, if you plant the wrong trees, for example, Scotland planted an awful lot of trees in the past on deep peat. What a disastrous idea that was. Those sorts of issues still happening around the world if we're not careful. And so we need to really have those in mind. Two key principles for me is, and this is one of the reasons why I think offsetting has had a bad name. One of them is longevity, right? So because what you're doing is promising basically that you will offset some emissions you can't avoid on aviation, for example, by doing something, that something needs to last. And one of the reasons why so much offsetting has a bad name is because people come back later and find it's no longer there, right? So there are all these promises. What people did is say, I'll borrow from Peter to pay Paul. Well, Paul's always going to be happy, isn't he? But what happened to Peter, right? So you need to, what people have been finding with the CDM mechanisms, for example, is that I promise that I'll emit all this fossil fuel just now, but I'll plant these trees that will last 50 years, come back 9 years later. Well, sorry, they all died. Sorry about that. But I've taken your money and spent it. Is that okay? No, it's not okay. So you have to find mechanisms, I think, that will, if you're going to do this, that you have some assurance that they have some longevity. Now, there's two ways you can define offsets. One is reductions and one is removals. Reductions is where the amount of carbon that would have been emitted is reduced. So what people are talking about here is, unless you'd given me that carbon offsets money, I would have cut those trees down. Now, I find personally that's not credible in the slightest. So some people will pay for that, but I won't. because I don't think it's credible. How the hell do I know what you're going to do with the trees? So pre-existing trees that I pay you not to cut down, that's called reductions. I pay people who would have used fossil fuels to instead use renewables. I don't find that credible. I provide you with solar lamps across Africa, very good project, but I'm not paying for it as an offset. So there are things like reductions that you will have to, as a university, come to a view on. Then there are what's called removals. That is more like I plant new trees, I restore new peatlands, and so on. I think they're credible, but they have to last. Right? So when we're planning it, what we're doing for Edinburgh, we want it to last at least 50 years, if not 100. We're being told by Oxford, and you'll see it in that guide that I popped in the chat, that actually you should think about thousands of years. You should think about deep geological storage. And so there's a conversation going on about what longevity means. But what I would urge folks is it doesn't mean 5 years and it doesn't mean 20. If you're going to do this, it's got to be much longer. The other thing is that one I just touched on, additionality. It has to be new. You don't want to be sucked into paying for something that you can't prove is new, because otherwise you're in that trap of lack of integrity in my mind. And so we are planning to rule out the market at Edinburgh and do it ourselves. Now, I don't have permission to do that. It's David Beards. I can see David Beards. He knows I've been talking about this for quite a few years. Will we ever get money to do it? I don't know. But I think I'd rather, from my perspective, do something ourselves that I know is additional genuinely than to rely on the market. Now, that's just my view, and others will use the market. But if you're going to use the market, ask those two questions on additionality and longevity. 2 or 3 things just to finish, because I've probably gone on too long already. Some universities are, wrongly in my mind, but again, people have to come to view, offsetting scope 1 and scope 2. I don't think that's right. I don't think you should be doing that. We won't be doing that. We'll offset scope 3 only. The logic being there are no solar planes at the minute. And so if I want to travel around the world, and sometimes I do, I want to offset the consequences of that temporarily until we have zero carbon aviation. I'm already, as remember, under the first principle, trying to reduce demand as much as possible. We are moving to effectively ban UK flights. But if you tell me that somebody who is flying out to Africa to study sleeping sickness and reduce disease should take a boat, it's just not credible. So I'm going to offset that sort of stuff, but I'm not going to offset any gas and any electric. And so I'm relying on Dean to do his bit on that side, because we're not offsetting that. That's quite an important one. The other one that might come up for you is, if you're an international university, what about your students traveling to and from outside term time? We're going to try and offset that as well if we can. Final point is, two final points. One is price. If somebody offers you an offset for £2 a tonne, good luck. If you want to take it, I find that absurdly incredible that you can do it for £2 a tonne. I'm thinking 15, 20, 25, 30. And again, because I think I want something additional, I don't believe I can plant trees at £2 a tonne. Just don't believe it. Why not? Because I have a chartered forester working for me and he tells me the costs, so I don't believe it. I could be wrong. Maybe you can. But that's why I think you need to keep going into the detail if you're going to do it. And then finally, we're universities, so look for wider benefits, even if you use the market. Can this be used for teaching? Can it be used for research? There is an argument that much of Scottish forestry has been unimaginative and assumes that unless you plant the trees in identical poles, and you churn up the earth with massive earth-moving equipment and releasing nitrous oxide and all that. But there are other thinking about forests. Maybe we should be encouraging that as part of this. So lots of questions and challenge. I hope that's useful, but that's just what we're thinking. And I'm not saying we're right. That's the important thing. I'm not saying we're right, but I'm saying we've given it quite a lot of thought. So if you are going to do it, I would urge you not to plunge in, but to have a look at that brief and to maybe just have a think about it before you get too far into it. Hope that's what you were hoping for.
That was brilliant, Dave. Thanks for that. And I appreciate you diving in to give us a talk. That's really enlightening. I think the purpose of this session is just to sort of give a whistle-stop tour through some of the main issues and what's happening at some of the campuses. And I think on the back of this, we'll set up some more detailed discussions. Whether this is the right forum for the offsetting discussion, I'm not sure, but I think that's going to become a really critical talking point amongst the different institutions. So that was really helpful. So I don't know who's chairing this thing. We're 20 minutes behind, and we're talking about Dave possibly speaking after we do a Q&A. Dave, are you able to stay through the whole session? Would that disrupt what your plans were? Dave Beards.
Yeah, I can stay until 12. No worries,
Okay.
just whenever you want me.
So I'm conscious that both Dave Gorman and Joanna maybe need to be away shortly. So if we just pause there and we give everyone, say, maybe 10 minutes for a few questions, if you raise your hand or put something into the chat, Jill can kind of respond and call your name when it's your turn to put your question up.
Did you say you want questions in the chat or
put your hand up?
So you can, at the bottom, there's a reactions button. You can select raise hand in that if you've got a question, or you can put your hand up the old-fashioned way. But it's split over 2 screens, so we might miss you.
So just while we're doing that, I thought that really the point that you were making, Joanna, around just looking at the sort of value of getting space efficiency savings versus the value of all of the capital expense that needs to go into energy efficiency improvements, I think it's a really, really valid point. Is that something that's being embraced at the University of Cambridge, or is that something that's being met by some challenge? I know certainly from the University of Edinburgh perspective, the number of people involved in that discussion and this idea of, you know, who owns the space and what might that look like over the next 20 years is a very, very challenging one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar at Cambridge. I mean, it's got new impetus as a result of COVID, and you know, and it is one of our 13 COVID recovery projects around reshaping this space. But I mean, that's going to take time, and undoubtedly there will be challenge from certain corners, you know, particularly those who may be losing space, you know. And you know, I do think, you know, if we're moving to more hybrid working and people are in the office, you know, maybe 1 day a week, if that, you know, the whole argument for individual offices changes. That doesn't mean they won't still want their individual offices, but you know, it's much harder to justify. So it will be interesting. It will be interesting.
I think a big challenge as well is planning energy efficiency investments. I know even at the simple level, what a good project looked like 2 years ago is very different now because there's a lot more uncertainty about how space may change, or if you want to deliver projects at scale, just because the boundaries move out so widely, you now have to be much more careful that you're putting that money across a much wider boundary of projects. It's going to be the same 10 years from now, and that uncertainty is challenging. But I think you know, for slowing down your investments is almost a good thing at this stage, just so you're taking that wider view and doing the right investment at the right time.
I think so. I think it varies. I mean, there are instances where, you know, the capital program for a particular site was actually going to support our decarbonisation program, and now it looks likely that capital program will be slowed because of COVID, and therefore the timescales to be able to implement the degasification measures on that site have slowed because we can't do it without that capital works.
So I think we've got questions from John Thorne was first, and then maybe Derek Mitchell, and then Jane Boyle.
Just a quick question for Joanna. If you're obviously dealing with a lot of historic buildings, how do you not penalise departments who are in historic buildings and have got less chance to save energy if you're charging? I think you said you were planning to charge departments. Is there some sort of equation in place, and maybe they're sharing with another department, and as we have a GSA, and maybe it's a public building, so a lot of the use is people just going in and out and they're nothing to do with the actual one of our 5 schools. So how do you handle that?
Well, what we're planning on doing is, firstly, when we, under our electricity devolution programme, we won't be charging them the actual cost of their electricity, recognising that different departments are in different types of buildings, and actually the tariffs are different, you know. So what we will do is we will set a university price for a kilowatt hour of electricity, and that's what they will be charged. That will obviously be grounded in what we actually pay for it, but it's not going to be, you know, actually what the individual departments on the listed buildings and the old buildings, that we're setting baselines on historic consumption, which is why COVID's thrown a major spanner into the work, because consumption over these 2 years has messed up the pattern, but that will enable, you know, it still raises challenges, as it always does, because what happens if a department moves from an old building into a brand new building, or vice versa? Their baseline is going to need to be adjusted, and we will need a mechanism for that. But it's not going to be perfect, and we're not pretending it's going to be perfect, but it should achieve the objective of providing local responsibility for electricity consumption, and an incentive for departments to look at how they can reduce their electricity consumption, particularly as we know a large proportion of consumption is due to plug load, which we in estates have very little, if any, control over.
And could they get to keep some of the lecky they save? Or?
Yeah, they do. They will. So they will get a baseline in kilowatt hours that will be transferred into a cost. Essentially, if they use less, then they don't have to pay. They get to keep that bit of the budget. If they lose more, they will have to find the money from within their own funds to pay for that.
Great. Derek, did you have a question? Your hand's gone down, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was a question for Joanna as well. I note from our slides, I was quite taken aback by the 200 million above business as usual cost, and I wondered what our executive reaction to that was, given that 2038, which was our target date, is 18 years away. So 18 into 200 million is above 10 million a year. And I wondered if anyone on our board has reacted to that additional cost in any way, because I wouldn't like to take it to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure which institution you're from, Derek, but I mean, that's in the context of a £20 million a year utility spend. What was quite nice actually is when we took it to council, we said, you know, achieving degasification, achieving the science-based target. This is when we were saying, will we sign up to our science-based target, will cost us money, you know, and some engineer somewhere had said 200 million pounds. And so when we did this study and it came out like 180 odd million, it's you know, that's not too bad. I mean, that's not every cost. It will cost more than that. But, you know, we've signed up to a science-based target, and we've now got to get there. So,
yeah,
I mean, we haven't done it. We haven't done it yet, Derek. But
right.
there is recognition that, you know, we will need to find the capital funding for it, and we are looking at various sources of funding.
Yeah, I do know some of the institutions are looking at setting that aside on an annualised basis. So I wondered if you'd gone to them and asked them for the first 12 million to go into the pot in year one, you know.
Yeah, well, we've got a nominal 50 million in the capital investment fund, you know, to start the work. We're also looking at things like the government funding for heat networks, you know, and that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, that was my question, really. Thank you.
Super,
I was
thank
University
you.
of Dundee. I'm from. Sorry,
Okay,
to say that.
thanks, yeah.
And then we've got one question from Jane at the University of Aberdeen.
My question was for Joanna as well. It's actually quite similar to John's question, but already had my hand up. So one of the things I just wanted to ask you about was we are kind of going through the process of trying to attribute every single kilowatt hour to basically different schools, buildings, you know, this kind of thing. But yeah, we have had quite a lot of pushback from people, because what we're trying to do is like normalise a lot of the data, because obviously if you've got quite intensive research buildings, they're always going to use a lot more energy than those that aren't. But it's almost like turned a bit political in certain areas, something, you know, that was supposed to help people take ownership, which, you know, when I've worked out, I guess outside the education sector is quite a standard way to do things, even in terms of reporting structures. We can't necessarily do it by building, because we have buildings where we have different schools sharing the buildings. So I was just wanting to ask you about that. Have you had any success in terms of actually, you know, charging your different schools and faculties, and the kind of feedback you've had from them as well?
So we never got to the stage that we rolled it out university-wide. We were in pilot year number 2 when COVID hit. There wasn't actually any money changing hands at that stage. It was just about the mechanism. I think it's about being pragmatic, you know, and coming on. not everyone will be happy, but we were working towards a pragmatic solution that looked at, with committee approval, and once committee approves it, that is it. But it was looking at things like, yes, we'll use historic baselines because then that accounts for the different types of buildings and the different types of work that goes on within them. Yes, we do have shared buildings, and we were going to do that on a floor, or we are doing that on a floor area basis. Thankfully, the departments in shared buildings tend to be the lower consumers. The big science, energy hungry building departments tend to have their own buildings, which are separately metered. We did invest a lot of metering in over the last few years anyway, which in part is supporting this, and at times we've just got to say, right, well, this is the pragmatic decision and this is how it's going to be moved forward, but actually this is how your baseline was set, this is how the budget you're receiving for this is set, and this is how you're being measured on it. So at least those three things are consistent, so it's really as fair as we can make it without it being an overly bureaucratic, and actually cost more to implement than we might actually save. And even the subject of sub-metering, because departments do move around, we can't even go down the route, which would be costly, of sub-metering every single space. So we could, that's why we took, in certain situations, we will do it on a floor area basis. We have also, which probably helps, since the introduction of the carbon reduction commitment, charged our departments a carbon levy, which started at £0.01 per kilowatt hour and had gone up to about 1.5%, that essentially brought in the amount of money it cost the university in their CRC allowances, and that was based on a very similar mechanism. So whilst the values were vastly different, the idea of them being charged for their electricity on this sort of basis has been socialised and in use in the university for several years, which I think helps.
Thanks, Joanna, and thanks for all your questions, everyone. I think we're significantly beyond where we planned to be, which is entirely my fault. So but I think it's maybe time to pause and let those who need to get away get away. It might be a good time for everyone just to take a 5-minute break for a tea or a comfort break. And do you have the results of the survey, Jill? Is it a good time to bring those up after we take a wee break?
Yes, I'll pull them up over the break.
Okay, so what I suggest is for the remainder of today, we take a 5-minute break, we come back, we look at the results from the survey, and then we open the floor up to have a wee chat if anyone wants to talk about what's happening at their institution or put more questions on the table. We've still got about, we'll have a good half an hour to get through that between now and 12.
And we're going to hear from David Beard.
Oh, sorry, no, my apologies. Dave Beards, who, I'm sorry, David, was meant to speak before the break, and due to a terrible job of chairing it, we're now going to have to ask Dave to speak after the 5-minute break. So I take full responsibility. So I'll see you all in 5 minutes.
So thanks very much, everyone.
Right, Dave?
Yeah, I'm really good. Playing any Tableau these days?
Not as much as I really want to, which has been my line for about 5 years. So that's the guy that used to play the tabla, not a guy that plays tabla. So
Increasingly, I'm also a guy that used to play the Tableau because I just play Packawedge these days.
you have a good excuse. Yeah. This used to be my music room, and it is now the office / storeroom / spare room, and soon to be my 2-year-old's room. So whatever slim hope I had is now ebbing away.
Well,
One day.
you can still learn the compositions. You don't have to play them.
That was my first tabla lesson. Is you don't need tabla to learn how to play tabla. You just need this. So
In fact, there's an electronic one I've seen now. It's just like a pair of plates, and it sounds great. Just using samples. So if you're short of space, don't give up.
I think lessons in this format might be the way forward for me. I was going to join the group in Edinburgh, but I'm not actually commuting into Edinburgh anymore. But I might, once that kicks off, make an effort just to get out to that group once a week. But failing that,
it
just
works
getting-
better than I thought. I mean, the latency of the connection is an issue, so it has to be kind of play and repeat kind of lesson. But so you missed the group synchronization, but I've learned tons in the last year because it's one-to-one. You know, in a group situation, you get left by yourself until the teacher comes back to you, and you know, are you getting on? So I get an hour of full attention, which is nice.
Yeah, that's really good. I take it your trip to Pune, it's not going to happen this year.
Looking grim in Maharashtra just now, so yeah. So we've been having monthly calls with some of those guys. You know, people will play, recite compositions, share some history. So yeah, we've been staying in touch with all those guys. And also the guys in California doing interviews with some of the guys who are now in nursing homes, trying to capture what they remember before they pass.
Right. Give everyone a wee minute, Jill, and then
I'll just be 5 minutes and then combine with the more general discussion.
still a lot of blank screens. We'll maybe give it a minute or two till everyone joins us. Key lesson from this morning is don't set a 5-minute time limit and then spend 15 minutes yourself talking. Be more realistic. So it was quite heartening for me to know that Joanna had indicated their utility spend is roughly what ours is, and that their capital cost for their energy master plan is pretty much exactly what we've costed. And there's also some big gaps and things they couldn't yet cost. And so that just made my heart swell a little bit to think we don't know if this is correct, but that's sounding like it's slightly more likely that it's starting to line up with what other people are coming up with. And I think we all have the same challenge that, picking up from Derek's question, is this on your capital plan? Question mark. The reality is some of it is. You just don't know it yet. And some of it would have been, notwithstanding, because you're looking over 20 years now, not just what you're spending your Salix fund on next year, or what SFC project is supporting the next 3 years. It's when you take that 20-year view, a lot of that will be in your capital plan. And I think that's really the important message here, but it is a whacking great chunk of capital that needs to be focused on something with much more attention than I think many institutions have focused on in the past over a much longer time period. I think on that note, understanding what support is available out there, both in terms of development and capital, and how we feed back into that is really important. So we're lucky to have Dave here to spend some time with us to chat through what the SFC's thoughts are on this energy master planning space looking forward. So Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Dean. There we go. Is shown okay, Joe?
Yes, they're perfect.
Grant. Okay, well, just to take a few minutes, given we're a bit behind schedule, what I really was interested in today was to hear about what energy projects you're planning, what you would like to take forward. And from that, to hear from you, how could SFC best design a scheme which would enable those projects to be supported? So what would you be looking for in terms of scheme characteristics that would work for you? So just to recap on recent schemes then, we've now deployed financial transactions over 4 years. So you can see the various schemes there. So in total over the 4 years, it's just shy of 180 million that's been deployed in loan funding. That's achieved a number of outcomes. There has been a reduction in the sector footprint. We estimate that's about 12,000 tonnes a year when all the projects are completed, which, you know, a lot of them are still in progress. University spaces for learning and enterprise have been upgraded. That's been good. And a lot of priority backlog maintenance has been addressed. So just to recap, the first programme we run had a strict focus on carbon reduction. The next 3 programmes are for more general purposes. So to draw a few conclusions from that, if I look at my, not that I do have a metric for pounds for carbon saved, but my metric is going down. Most of the carbon we saved was in that first programme. So clearly when you allow universities to use the funds for general purposes, and given, you know, there's not that much capital funding available for refurb and maintenance, the funding will go for those more general purposes. So that's one reflection on the programs we've run to date. Just to give you an example of some of the projects, so there's 3 energy projects there. The St Andrews one you heard about earlier on in Dean's presentation on the St Andrews work, that's in progress. And just to note, that was from our 2018 programme. Aberdeen University one, the combined heat and power and the citywide district heating network, that was funded last year, completion date estimated to be January 2023. And then the newest one is the one at the bottom, Strathclyde University. You'll be aware of the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland. So the funding we've just signed off there will enable a solar canopy to be installed, so electric vehicles, electric bikes and so on, helping that enterprise facility become zero carbon, which I think is it's part of the vision. So 3 fairly diverse energy projects there. A couple of conclusions to draw. Energy projects take time, even if it's just procuring solar panels. My experience, perhaps yours too, that always seems to take a bit longer than people expect. That could be to do with design, could be to do with a procurement strategy, could be to do with the grid connection strategy, so things outside the campus of the university, maybe negotiating with other parties. All of these things can complicate energy projects. I'm sure you know that better than me. But it gives us an issue in that the funds, typically SFC has to distribute our single year funds, and the government wants to see them invested, well, within 18 months or so of leaving our office. What I'm observing is these energy projects typically take some longer time than that. And I just think we need to go into these things with our eyes open. The other thing to say is, just reflecting on the St Andrews work, is some of the work at Guardbridge, I put it in the chat, half of that funding came from the Spruce Fund, which really was a fund not so much about low carbon, it was about urban regeneration. So the context of Guardbridge was unemployment, chance to regenerate an industrial site. So when you're looking at energy projects, it may well be some of your funding could come from a source that's not obviously about climate change. So an encouragement to be creative. So drawing conclusions from all of that, 12,000 tonnes is quite a lot. Clearly, given the legislative targets, I think we need to pick up the pace. We also need to secure more investment somehow. So we put in 180 million. We've heard larger sums discussed today, even in the context of a single university. So, you know, I need to make the case for investment. I think we also need to look at focus. So as I say, the most carbon we saved was in our smallest programme, but it's the one where we had the clearest focus. Therefore, I mean, none of these are surprising conclusions, I'm sure. So for our current programme, new financial year just started, we've got £34 million to spend in our financial transactions programme. The proposal is that we target this exclusively on climate emergency carbon emissions project. Now, for discussion, what do I mean by exclusively? clearly you might want to bundle in other works associated with the energy side of things, so we can discuss, you know, exactly how we express that. But the purpose of these projects, the main purpose is about carbon emissions. So in terms of scheme criteria, we might put that as the exclusive criteria. How much is it going to save? So not so much about the student experience, not so much about other factors, just on carbon. But all these things are in play, so I'd like to hear from you how the scheme might best be designed to help you. Timescales, well, up for negotiation, but we need to conclude by March next year. So something like expressions of interest invited in the next month or two, with full applications from late summer, with a view to getting a shortlist by Christmas or something like that. In terms of the outcomes, well, we would like this to relate to progressing your climate change plans and to support collaboration where feasible. Now, I've observed that energy projects take longer than we think, and when you start involving collaborative partners, that does make for a richer project, and I think it's attractive from many contexts, but it will make your project more complicated. So we do seek collaboration where feasible. This could relate to shared facilities, again, big agenda for the government, but we have to be aware negotiating with other people will make for a more complex project. So two questions at the end there that I'd like to come back to, but just before we leave this, whenever I do these presentations, someone from colleges says, what about us? So a slide on the college funding situation then. Now we are in the pre-election period, so I'm not making any announcements. This is public information, I hope. So you'll have seen in the programme for government that there's £95 million available for decarbonising public buildings. So this is colleges, NHS, NDPBs, and so on. So we need to get a slice of that for the college sector. There is the draft heat and buildings consultation that's currently out. It's a bit epic, but you may wish to comment on sections of that. So where do we need to get to with colleges? Well, fairly urgently, we need to update project registers and carbon management plans. From my understanding of the way the funding will be deployed, they will be looking for a mixture of early wins. So yeah, I mean, changing the light bulbs and those kind of things that could be progressed quite speedily, but also planning with a view to more substantial projects towards the end of the 5-year period. So yeah, we need a bit of short-term and long-term. But also, you know, 95 million, even if all of that was spent on colleges, it wouldn't be enough, I think. So if we get a slice of that for colleges, I think we need to use that 5-year period to build our evidence base, to get more money, to inform, you know, future spending reviews and that kind of stuff. So for me, there's an immediate challenge with college colleagues just to how do we scope out the opportunities, business case development and so on. I think that's our immediate challenge for the next 9 months, something like that. And in all of this, to think about the wider context. So there is the national net zero strategy. We'll see more detail on that, about when gas is being phased out and these kinds of questions. So there's always a wider context in terms of your projects as you put these things together that we need to be aware of. Okay, so I probably spoke for longer than I thought, but any questions about how we design a scheme that would be most helpful to you and the kinds of big energy projects that you would like to propose? Thanks, Dean.
Sorry, just to Dave, is one quick question. So the 34 million, is that in the form of a low interest loan?
Yes, it will be.
There's a couple of questions in the chat box, David. So you've already answered Martin's question about the college situation. Jane from Aberdeen's asking if you can share a link to the specific criteria for project funding.
We haven't designed the criteria yet, and that was part of what I was hoping to discuss today. So we might just have a single criteria, you know, amount of carbon saved, and we'll go for the biggest projects, which might mean, you know, we fund 2 big projects. Equally, you might say, let's fund lots of smaller ones. That's fine. Really open to hearing from you. So in previous years, we've had, you know, other criteria on student experience because we're looking at learning spaces. I'm minded, given the experience, to focus quite specifically on energy, and I guess heat seems to be the biggest chunk of the energy pie.
Super. And then Jane's saying, is this purely CapEx fund?
Yes, so there'll be a one-off capital from us for capital works.
Super. And then David Charles from Strathclyde's got a question. Do you want to unmute, David?
Yeah. I think it's probably a good idea to have the fund being focused, and I can understand why you'd move away from student experience. But I think one thing that I would advocate you be minded of is that we, for example, we're creating climate neutral districts. You'll probably know this from funding we got for EMIS, for example. And as part of that, we're looking at adaptations, a big piece of that. And we also have a biodiversity crisis. I think we need to make sure that the funding isn't purely on carbon savings. I think it's okay if that's the main focus, but I think we should allow some scope for having green infrastructure integrated, because there's no reason. I think often they're treated as in conflict with each other. You know, you can have solar panels or you can have a green roof, but actually you can have both. You can have solar panels and you can have grasscrete. You can have, there's various different ways you can implement these things together. And I think that needs to be more carefully thought of. And it's something that certainly Climate Ready Clyde and Adaptations Scotland would say this needs to be focused on. And maybe, I don't know whether that's within SFC's scope, and maybe we need to look at leveraging funding from other organisations, but certainly it should be mentioned, I think, in the funding.
I think Martin from Ed McCall was next.
Hi, yeah, David. Yeah, thanks for answering my question just as I put it in the box. That was good. It kind of relates to that, I suppose, and it touches on something other folk have mentioned, which is making the sort of right investment choices. I think Dean mentioned it in terms of not just kind of following whatever we happen to know about. I guess in terms of the colleges, it's as much about if we're going to develop kind of projects register. I guess it's how the support we might be able to get in developing that. Because to be brutally honest, we don't necessarily have some of the skills and expertise to develop a really sound kind of set of business cases for what would be the best projects going forward. So I suppose that's what I would like to be considered within the kind of program. That's all. I don't know if you've discussed that already with Jill and others.
We have had some discussions on that, Martin, and there will be, if you use the non-domestic energy efficiency framework, there is support within that to develop business cases. So what I'm trying to work out is what level of information do we need to get to be able to even progress to the framework and access the support from there. But yeah, it's a live discussion and we will try and secure some resource for the reasons you mentioned. Thank you.
Then I think Jane from Aberdeen has another question.
Yes, it was just kind of touching on, I think it was maybe David's question, when he was saying it's just if it's purely on carbon emissions. Another thing that I'm looking at now, and I think is becoming more of an impact, is social issue. So I tend to find a lot of these frameworks, it doesn't necessarily address that. Is that something you would potentially include? Because I think certainly in Aberdeen, I think it's really important at the moment. Obviously, the oil industry is taking a massive hit. So, you know, a lot of people have lost their jobs, high unemployment. And one of the aspects that I'm trying to encourage, if we do get any new kind of technologies, can we somehow link in, you know, maybe whether, is it an apprenticeship scheme? Is it something that we could even try and link into courses at the university? So, you know, maybe like graduates could then, you know, come and assist in whatever this specialist technology may be.
These are all dimensions of what I would say is an excellent project. And think back to Guard Bridge, you know, the community benefits, the protection of the nature reserve and all those things. My observation was Guard Bridge was a long time in the planning, even before we put the money in 2013. And then I think it was 5 years before they actually switched the CHP on. So, you know, these more complex projects are great. They will take more time to plan. And as someone said, you know, there's a chance to leverage in other funding. So I'm kind of torn between the emergency of the climate situation, the need to you know, reduce carbon quickly, the fact that the government in accounting terms needs us to mobilize the funding really within 18 months of releasing it, all kind of make that more desirable project a bit more difficult to deliver. And I guess what I'm trying to do today is, can we start designing the projects now? And if the funding does become available in a hurry, well, we've kind of warmed up the more complex picture that I think we all want to deliver on.
John Thorne has another question in the chat. Do you want to unmute yourself, John?
Yeah, it was just about, sorry if I missed this, but is there a target, you know, pounds spent per kilo of CO2 saved or kilowatt hour generated that's fixed for projects?
Not an SFC one. Sometimes we do work with Salix, and they do have those kind of metrics. So we have used them to rank projects. And as I say, in designing the scheme, depending on how big a criterion we make that could suggest that the leading projects. So I think, what's it, Salix is £200 a tonne? Pounds invested for carbon saved, something like that. So we've never, and certainly in the last couple of financial transactions rounds, I mean, we were way off that because the projects had many other benefits, and that was fine. What's most important from a loan funding point of view, that we reassured the university has the ability within the project to save money that's going to enable them to repay the loan. So what we try to look at with the more recent projects that we're going to deliver a better student experience, how does that translate into a better position for the university, that they were confident that they'd be able to repay the funds, even if you couldn't see that in a straight line from, say, the engineering information. But yeah, we can establish a metric. If everyone agrees, that would be the most helpful thing to do.
And I agree as well, as previously been said, that social justice plays an important part here. And I personally got real concerns about net zero and carbon offsetting, but I think these are things we should explore as leaders in our field.
One thing that's jumping out in this discussion is everybody has a fairly well-rounded understanding of what a good climate strategy needs to look like, particularly in the energy realm. And it's quite heartening to, my apologies, my 2-year-old has just walked in the door screaming. It seems to me what you've referenced, Dave, is that, you know, the funding is there to move a climate strategy forward. And if that climate strategy shows how this project fits into a much broader whole, that seems to tick all the boxes. But I think that's so important for all of our strategies that need to take that 20-year horizon and understand how this little piece is fitting into either a demonstration of how you can scale that out, or a critical piece on that rung of the ladder to move your climate strategy forward. And it's not just about energy saving, it's about all these other wider social, paving that way for investments which will help student experience, the regional community, bring in wider social issues. So it seems to me that's quite a good criteria, or quite a good test to make sure that institutions have thought about that wider piece, and they know where this particular project fits into it and why it's necessary. I'm going to mute and go close my door, so somebody else has a question.
Well, certainly say there was some exemplary practice at Strathclyde in the district heating scheme there, where they did do community engagement. Interesting, I think there was an apprenticeship scheme within that as well. So engaging people in the technologies that were being deployed, and then also the idea of the university within the city catalyzing, you know, citywide developments. I mean, these are all brilliant things to achieve. But again, Strathclyde DH was 5 years in the planning before it operationalized.
You know, tell you 10 probably, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was a long time coming, but lots of lessons learned. I think that's the just the point, Dave, about whatever challenges were in place 10 years ago about bringing different silos together to look at what good looks like in a kind of particularly a municipal or a regional setting. That's exacerbated now, because what we're trying to achieve is much larger scale, accelerated timelines. You know, so in reference for ourselves, one of the sites we're looking at brings together NHS, the university, private housing development, Scottish Enterprise. So all the red flags go up on timescales and getting everybody sort of teed up, and even simple things about how do we access capital funding, you know, and then how do we share out the benefit. All of that becomes very, very complex, but the puzzles we all need to, everyone's context will be different. I know for us, regional partnerships are absolutely paramount to our low carbon strategy, whether that's working with other heat off takers or the DNO or technology delivery partners, very critical, but nothing that's going to happen in 18 months. So just to go back to your point, Dave, I've kind of lost track of what some of the Salix metrics are over the past couple of years, but I seem to remember in heat, it was kind of edging, someone please correct me on this, it was edging up to sort of between 400-600 pounds per ton on the heat side of things. Have I got that right? Because I know anything that certainly we've been looking at falls way below the Salix kind of wider criteria. Is anybody out on the can anyone wade in and,
Are you talking about carbon abatement cost?
yeah,
Um,
well, the Salix kind of simplified metric of that, sort of pounds per lifetime CO2.
yeah,
I think Derek might know. He's got his hand up.
No, I don't.
Sorry. Okay.
it depends on the project, I think, but the recycling fund's gone up to, I think, 250 pounds per lifetime.
Yeah, it was 200 at one point, like David had said. David Baird had said.
Dean, your sound is breaking up again. Something that you
Apologies.
could try.
I'll shut
No,
up.
it's okay. No, you could try turning your camera off, and it might improve the quality of your sound. That sometimes.
The quality of this will improve if you just take your face off the screen, Dean. Try that.
No, I can hear you fine now.
That's fine. Yeah. As I said, I've used up my. I do have a route to improve this, but I've used up all the university's data allowance for me for the month already. So.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments on that? Derek?
Yeah, I had a question for David. David, we were considering in our new innovation hub ground source heat pump. It's a specialist one, it's an ERDA one, so it's a sort of geothermal heat pump. The problem with it is that not only is it going to be a much more expensive installation than the standard installation, which I'm talking about boilers and chillers here, but it will also have higher running costs. Now, in the past, you mentioned Salix, we'll be able to sell borrowing money or loans in respect of the fact that they had a payback. But some of these decarbonisation projects are actually going to cost more to run. So there is no 7-year or 8-year financial payback that Salix will allow. It's an actual cost. So I didn't know if a better way of future funding might be grants that could contribute. So maybe a match funded grant system or something, so that, you know, someone's putting in to actually offset this additional cost, or is that maybe wishful thinking?
Derek, I would love to be offering grants rather than loans. It's just where we are.
Yeah.
Well, we can argue for grants as well. So, you know, let's not give up on that. But capital funding is not what it was 10 years ago. There's not a red line for us in terms of what the cost of that heat pump might be, or the ongoing cost of running it. What we would do in every case is look at the financial health of the university or college and just say, can they afford this? So, you know, our accountants will be all over that. The easiest argument to make is if it washes its face in spend terms. But if you can make the argument it supports your carbon plan and our accountants believe you can afford it, then no reason not to go ahead.
I think we're quite happy. There's an additional cost in terms of both maintenance and energy to the traditional installation. And we would probably be quite happy to fund that, given it's a building that's not got a huge, extensive kilowatt hours or 1 million kilowatt hours of heat, I think, is the project. But on the capital side, it's going to be £1 million extra. Now, our problem, I think, is that this building has been already funded through the Tay Cities deal. And I don't think we would be then eligible, I'm not 100% sure, to apply for any grant funding, given that it's government funding that the Tay Cities deal is. I always thought there was this, you know, double benefit kind of, you weren't allowed. I'm not 100% sure. We could perhaps have a discussion out with this forum about that, if you think it's still possible.
Yeah, very happy to do that, Derek. I mean, we did in the last round contribute to the Tay Cities deal, the biomedical cluster. Is that the one you're thinking about?
Yes, yes.
Right.
So if you've already contributed, then I'm thinking that perhaps this isn't going to be this extra £1 million isn't going to be looked upon as, it's a double benefit to us.
Well, worth another discussion, certainly.
Okay.
'Cause,
Yeah.
yeah, city deal's a
Yeah.
big deal, and you can only do it once. So
Yeah.
let's not
It's a
build
bit
the wrong
like-
thing here.
Yeah, a bit like the Salex funding, we borrowed money and did some PV, and of course we were entitled to the funding, but we couldn't claim the tariff because the feed-in tariff, because it was seen as a double benefit, if you like. So I just wondered if that same rule applied for this heat pump over at the hub.
I think there are stated issues with using government borrowing to fund what would essentially be an income stream in the energy market. I think that's the issue there, Derek.
Yeah, well, it's not an income stream, it's actual expenditure this time, so it might be slightly different. So we'll have a discussion outside this.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
So just going to weigh in there. We've got about 10 minutes left today. Is there any interest in people taking 5 minutes just to quickly skim through the results of the survey? Or would people be, yeah, there's some nodding heads there. Okay.
Sure, okay, I'll share my screen then to show you all.
And I'm just thinking, David Beards, we didn't ask any specific questions about, if 35 million pounds was available, what would you like to spend it on? Would it be worth us putting together just a handful of questions, or to allow the group to come back with some specific responses on where people would like to target that funding? Would that be helpful to you?
Please do. We're just starting the discussion today, Dean, so input from you all collectively or individually is welcome.
So maybe I'll put this to the group if people are interested in that, but maybe in the same format that Jill's put out, we can think up a few questions that would just capture in a 3-minute survey where, if this funding was available, where people would see benefited in it being spent to meet the criteria that David has set out for us. We'll maybe try to put that together this week and get it sent out early next week, with a view to getting that back to the SSE, because that'd be quite interesting. We focused a little bit more on the energy master planning piece. What kind of heat supply technologies are you looking at, et cetera? But in terms of what you immediately need money for, what has come out of the survey here is, a lot of people have funded feasibility studies, but maybe need support to do things like technology, scoping studies at another level of detail. Which suggests that might be used to tee up a funded project from the SFC. So maybe it's not the best format, but if we scroll to the top.
So we get 16 responses. I'll pull it out and share it in a better format later, but this is just what you get immediately for the summary. So do you want to chat through it, and you just tell me when to scroll down to the next bit? Sure.
So it just really quickly, it looks like most institutions have set some kind of formal net zero strategy. And it looks like 2040 is the sort of predominant date. Some people sort of coming in ahead of that, some coming in behind that. I think scrolling down, what emission sources are people scoping into their baseline against which they need to meet zero? That's quite interesting. So everyone's scoping in their sort of scope 1 and scope 2. There's a lot more people scoping in wastewater business travel than I would have anticipated, just taking a guess. So that's quite interesting and really positive. And kind of a mixed bag around things like aviation and commuting. Business travel seems to be very strongly sitting in the baseline, but student commuting, procurement, international travel, a bit of a mixed bag. So that's quite an interesting one. But certainly there's a lot of ambition in growing that baseline out. That's really quite interesting. Scrolling down, number 5, what do your institutional approaches? Pretty overwhelming. Investing in energy efficiency, and then investing in heat decarbonization, and then investing in offsetting. So I think everyone is agreeing what good looks like in that space. What level of greenhouse gas emissions reduction do you anticipate? So this was really aimed at, what are your residual emissions that are going to be left over after you've spent your, the 200 million pounds, and it looks like that's a fairly mixed bag as well. But a lot of people, very few people are getting their institution down to zero with their current investment strategies. And a lot of people are still sitting there with something above 20, 30, 40, up to 80% emissions. So obviously a lot of institutional thinking in that space tied into what's scoped into your baseline around what your residual emissions look like and what your offsetting strategy looks like. So this is sort of touching on some of the issues that the SFC might be interested in. So what level of progress are you at? So most people have completed some kind of scoping studies, which would be expected. Technology feasibility studies, you scroll down. A lot of people still having to bring in some expertise around specific technologies. And I think, you know, we're all at that stage now where the sort of free desktop advice from most of your technology providers will no longer cut it. We'll need, you know, some formal mechanisms. Just pointing out to everybody, there is LCITP development funding that's out there for this kind of thing. And lots of support from Resource Efficient Scotland, and reading into the heat building strategy, more funding coming through that space to help people do feasibility studies and development work, particularly around the heat networks realm. So if anyone that's not got access to that development funding support, I would highly recommend looking at that. Outline business case. So almost everybody still needs to do their outline business case. So this is requiring quite a lot more fee and quite a lot more specific technical design and finance modeling. And really, to get to that stage, you need to have a pretty clear idea of what technology it is you're designing and what that means. And you know, drawing on our experience, you need to know specifically what building level energy efficiency projects are supporting that technology installation to size it up correctly. So that maybe leads into, so if people have done some of that feasibility work, that might lead into answering some of Dave's questions about where we think we need some funding to support to kick off projects. I'll just throw this out there for us. We've got about £15 million worth of lab ventilation works that are screaming out for funding. Lots of wasted heat in our laboratories across the HE estate, which we need to do something a bit more clever with. And those are excellent pilot projects. You get a couple of labs squared away, and that just becomes your model for what needs to happen in those spaces down the line. Costed business cases post-tender. So obviously that would follow on from the outlined business cases. Everyone still needs to do that. See, David Charles is just saying they're struggling to secure internal funding for scoping studies. So lots of space there. Technical design development, most people still needing to do that as well. Scrolling down. To what degree is your energy strategy net zero cost sitting in your capital plan? Almost everybody is none. Well, 3/4 of people are none or minimally. Just out of curiosity, does anyone want to stick their hand up and said who has their capital costs already significantly built into their capital plan? It's very quiet out there. David?
Yep.
David's the man on the money. Good job, David. So is that always been in the capital plan, David, or is that starting to take a stronger focus? What steps have been taken to make sure it's built into the capital plan, sort of presumably reprioritization?
Yes, it's all built around this climate neutral districts vision, and a lot of it's to do with meeting Passive House standards. So any new build we're saying has to meet Passive House or Passive House Plus. And yes, it's basically we're putting much more rigorous conditions on any new build developments, that they have to be net zero ready.
And in terms of infrastructure investments, sort of beyond new build and construction, is that any new costs coming online to decarbonize heat and things like that? Is that built into the capital plan, or is that?
No, not currently, but we're doing the scoping study. Well, it's out to tender. We've had returns back. We're about to go into negotiations because the cost came back fairly astronomical compared to what we were expecting. That was part of my comment.
I think that's quite an interesting one because
I don't know if anybody else has seen this, but the pandemic seems to have pushed costs up significantly for this kind of thing.
I've noticed we've seen a lot of our capital costs for some of our new build projects go up on the back of sort of increasing steel prices and things like that. Which is
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the pandemic. I think Brexit is also factoring into that. But certainly this period of time, our procurement department say they're seeing basically all tender returns coming back higher than they would anticipate.
Thanks, David. So we just scroll on a wee bit. Relative priorities. So still a few people, combined heat and power, gas-fired heat, but most people have been away from that. Heat pumps, very significant across the sector, which has a lot of knock-on implications on things like energy efficiency strategies in buildings. Third-party heat, also quite significant across the sector. I'm thinking for those for whom that is significant, we might set up another little subgroup to meet and chat about that. Because I know those of us who have heat networks and are embedded in city regions where there are possibly heat network zones emerging, which we'll have to compete with and have to start complying with the heat networks bill. Some interesting chats we can have, I think, is that group to whom that is significant. So I think we'll set up a sub meeting of this for those that are interested in that. Heat network development. I'm sure those who have waded into the 190 pages of the heat and building strategy, if you have a heat network, you get a zero carbon pass. It just shifts the problem onto your ESCO or your university in another form to decarbonize that heat. But very interesting space in Scotland, I think, what's happening with heat networks. Heat network efficiency, it's a similar story. On-site wind and solar, minimal for most people. That's interesting. I think for those for whom that is an option, again, maybe worth having a group that is looking at wind investments or looking at where large-scale solar might fit into their plans. I think for us, we have some interest in how you start to mix these technologies. So how do you over the next decade, how do you bring a gas-fired CHP engine and a solar farm and other sources of generation onto a network, which then can possibly export into the DNO, and where does SPEN sit in that space? Lots of interesting projects, I think, to maybe look at integrating with district network development, grid balancing mechanisms, things like that. Hydrogen, kind of overwhelmingly being pushed into the long grass there, I think, for everybody. Biomass, similar. Building energy efficiency, that's it, right? So I think we maybe do some follow-up questions for the SFC on, in the context of the climate strategy, what is it we're needing to do in terms of efficiency and how can we use that funding to accelerate that? Building fabric, that's an interesting one, very significant. I know for us, it pushes the net present value of our energy master plan way in the wrong direction when we start doing fabric upgrades. So how that integrates with the capital plan, and as David referenced, passive certification, particularly in the retrofit space, very interesting one. Minimal offsetting, that surprised me. I thought offsetting would be a much more significant strand for many people, but that's heartening to see everybody's moving in the same direction. Brilliant. So I think this bit becomes a little bit more cumbersome to unpick from this format. So we'll maybe, in the interests of time and in the interests of people being able to pick through this last section in another format, we'll maybe call it a day there.
Yeah, I can share the results in a nicer format with the resources from the meeting. So I was just going to do a really very short update. Basically, everything I'm going to send all the resources to everybody and a follow-up survey if anyone's got any comments or ideas for future meetings or would like to be involved in any of the groups that Dean has proposed just now. The one thing that I would like to draw your attention to is we're having a Sustainable Construction Topic Support Network meeting on the 12th of May. We're going to be focusing on Passive House. Passive House Trust are going to come and speak about the work that they've been doing about getting to net zero. And we're also having an update on the net zero public sector building standards from Jamie Goff at the Scottish Futures Trust. So if you or any of your colleagues would be interested in attending, please pass on the details. I'm happy to help people sign up if they don't normally come to our events. Yeah, just let me know.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry, that was a car crash of a sharing session today. We're way overdue, speakers everywhere, large gaps between presentations. All I can say is I'll do better next time. I think there's a lot of interesting subgroups that can spin out from this, and so we'll have a wee chat about how to set those up, but please do send send your thoughts through. This is meant to be everybody's group. I can also apologize that this was a bit sort of Dean Drobot heavy in the presentations, but I think it was just that time of year. Lots of people are on annual leave, so it would be really good to hear about what's happening in other institutions. I know what I was hoping to hear from some others on the call today, specifically about what's happening in their institutions. We can maybe do a follow-up session. I really would like to hear what's happening elsewhere. I think I've learned a lot today from what everyone's been speaking about. There's lots that I didn't know that was going on in the sector. That's really what I miss about us all being able to get together in a room and have these kind of chats. So we'll maybe work on having these at a bit greater frequency over the next year or so. And with that, thank you very much for your time, everyone. Jill, thanks for keeping us right, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you sooner rather than later. And with much thanks, David, for coming out to speak to us today. That was excellent, and we'll try to do what we can to give you some positive feedback. And I know Dave Gorman and Joanna have left, and Keith wasn't able to join us today, but I'll send on our thanks to them as well. That's really good to hear from them.
Cheers, Dean.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Dean.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.